Today I want to share with you the story of a woman whose life and legend has a lot to teach us about our own lives. A lot to teach us about what does it mean to be a vessel of the sacred, a vessel of God, a vessel of justice. Her story reminds us that sometimes we are called upon for an important task at the most inopportune moments. I realize that we're still a few months away from Christmas, but I want to talk about Mary this morning. That would be Mother Mary, the mother of Jesus. Her story has some of the keys to a meaningful life. Now, you might be wondering what put me onto this subject on this beautiful, cool autumn morning. You might be thinking it's bad enough that Walmart and the department stores bring out Christmas this early every year, earlier and earlier. You're thinking, not All Souls too. But it was our guest this morning from Nicaragua. I don't know about you, but I've never really studied much or learned much about Nicaragua. So when I heard we were going to have these guests here, I decided that I was going to learn a little bit and do some research about Nicaragua. And I found some incredible things. They have a rich history of politics and art, music, religion, and much more. Tienen una gran historia. They have a great and grand history. And something that caught my attention about Nicaragua is that the most celebrated and venerated holiday in that Catholic country is not Christmas and the birth of Christ, and it's not Easter and the resurrection of Christ. You think to yourself, well, what could it be if it's not those two things? And it happens to be the Feast of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. It is the most important holiday in Nicaragua. Now, I began wondering, how is this? How could it possibly be that in a culture that is so male-dominated, Elba said, so filled with machismo, rooted in such strong Catholic culture, which speaks of God mostly in male terms, as Father and as Son, in a religion whose believes that male leadership is ordained by God above female leadership, how is it that a woman could become this venerated? And what I discovered was so fascinating and so relevant to our times and our lives that I thought I need to bring this to the church. I brought this all the way to the 8:30 point humanist service this morning because I felt it needed to be told. Now, for those who don't know about the Feast of the Immaculate Conception in the Catholic Church, it is a commemoration of the birth of the Virgin Mother, Mary, Mother of Jesus, because in Catholicism there is a belief. You don't see this in most of Christianity, but there is a belief in Catholicism that not only Jesus was born without sin, but that Mary, his mother, was also born without the taint of sin. And Catholic churches around the world on the second week of December, they celebrate this feast. Now, I'm always reminded when I hear of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception of a joke that I once heard. And it's based in the famous biblical story of Jesus coming into the temple, and there's an adulterous woman, a woman who's committed adultery, and the people are there, and they've got stones, and they're ready to stone her, as is expected and decreed by the Hebrew Scriptures for a woman who has cheated on her husband or committed adultery. So here they are, and they've got their stones, and Jesus gets in between the crowd and the woman, and he says, let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. And all of a sudden, the stone comes whizzing past Jesus' face, and he's surprised, and he's looking out there, and he says, Mom! Now, in the Bible story, it didn't exactly happen that way. Apparently, Mary was not with Jesus on that particular occasion. But all jokes aside, I never fully understood a number of things about the traditions around Mary and why many Christians think that one of the features that makes Christianity unique among all the faiths and traditions of the world is the birth of the Savior, Jesus Christ, through a virgin. So think about the history, though, for a minute. There are numerous pre-Christian pagan religions that have examples of women or a goddess who's done the same. There's Isis, there's Ishtar, there's Demeter, there's Sybil. These are but a few of the goddesses who were believed to be both virgins and mothers. And there are copious stories in pre-Christian history of women, and mythology, of women who coupled with a god, producing a baby who was understood to be part human and part God. Moreover, in a number of these pre-Christian myths, the child eventually dies, and guess what? Is reborn 3 days later. So for me, knowing all of that, the story of Mary has never seemed quite that unique or original, or to be honest, even that compelling. But if you go back to the book of Luke, and look at Mary's song of praise called the Magnificat, it is an incredible piece of poetry and possibility. In it, we hear of a God who comes into the world to upend the status quo for justice. In the Bible, in Mary, we find God working for the good of the world through a poor, impoverished girl who is also an unwed pregnant teenager. In other words, in almost every way in that ancient culture, she was the lowest of statuses. In the Magnificat, she was a woman. She was young. She was pregnant. She was from Galilee. For all these reasons, she was considered very low status in the culture. And yet, the story says that she was surprised by a voice that said, "No, you, ordinary, low status person, will be the vehicle through which justice and sacredness and God will come into the world." Now in the Magnificat it says, "God has put down the mighty from their seats and exalted the poor. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty." Did you know that these passages are considered so subversive to oppressive governments and so inspiring to the poor of the world that during the 1980s, the government of Guatemala banned the public recitation of the Magnificat? Now suddenly I'm realizing that this woman and this story that I had so easily discounted is a lot more compelling and a lot more powerful than I ever imagined. I began to see why she's so beloved by the world's poor and oppressed. She represents hope and the reversal of fortune and the possibility that justice will someday reign. She represents a poor girl with no name and no status becoming the vehicle for God and for justice. She represents to us that despite being unmarried and pregnant and a teenager, that a person can become someone who can inspire the world toward hope. The story of Mother Mary in Mexico is very telling about how it is that Mary has become so beloved in so many places, not just in Central America, but around the world. Here's how the story goes. It says that almost 500 years ago on a hilltop just over Mexico City, it was barely 10 years after the invasion of Mexico by Cortez and his conquistadors, 10 years after, an Indian man named Juan Diego was crossing over a hilltop that had for a long time been associated with the indigenous goddess Tonantzin. So this hilltop had always been associated with this goddess. But on this day, at the top, he was surprised of the appearance of a beautiful lady who called to him in the indigenous language, She was brown-skinned, like many of the locals, and her garments were luminous, and she said that she was the ever-virgin Holy Mary, Mother of God. And she wanted him to build a Catholic church and a hermitage on that spot. Now, it took Juan Diego a while to convince the bishops in Mexico City that his vision was real. But eventually they came to believe him, and a church to Mary was built on that spot that had previously been the place of worship of this goddess. Now, the acceptance of a brown-skinned Mary, Virgin Mary, was said to accelerate the spread of Christianity and Catholicism throughout Mexico and Central America like nothing else. This Mary looked like a mestiza, a mixed-race woman. What had until then been seen as a scandal of mixed race between the indigenous people and the Spanish invaders suddenly had a holy face. One of the geniuses of Christianity, and Catholicism in particular, has been its ability to replace indigenous religions wherever it has gone and replace its symbols with their symbols and with Christianity's symbols. Now, Mary, as you know, came to replace the worship of the indigenous goddesses all over the world. Now, in one way, we might say that she has come to preserve the worship of the goddess among the people of many cultures at a time when the goddess and the divine feminine were being eradicated. One of the great spiritual losses that came with the spread of Christianity as we know it and continued through the spread of Islam was the loss of the connection to the divine feminine. In some of the earliest religious expressions of humanity, we find holiness represented in the form of the female. It's easy to understand why. Since the female body is a natural symbol for the image of the divine. The cycles of the female body echo the tides of the sea and the cycles of the moon. Women and their bodies are able to produce new life. Women's bodies nourish and sustain life, producing milk and caring for the young. It seems perfectly natural that the image of the Creator would be linked to an image that echoes the cycles of the seasons and the oceans, and one that has the ability to bring forth new life, and that is filled with nourishment and care. So how ironic is it that in the biblical book of Genesis, which is the foundation of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all the Abrahamic faiths, that humanity, that woman is born out of a man. For all the rest of history, men and women have been born out of a woman. But in this story, the very first birth of a woman starts with a man. How convenient for spreading a patriarchal culture and ideology throughout the world. The spread of these religions, as you know, was the beginning of the end of much of goddess worship around the world, and much of the end of the expression of the divine feminine in their cultures. Now, in Christianity, God is mostly depicted as male, as father, as son, in art and in language. And in some of the most significant Christian denominations, men are the only ones who are seen to be worthy and ordained to be leaders. The Abrahamic faiths continue in most places to uphold male forms of power and dominance. And yet, alongside this deeply entrenched patriarchal system, Mary has come to be venerated. And this has come about primarily through grassroots efforts by the worshipers and not by the sanction of ecclesiastical authorities. In other words, there is something subversive in the veneration of Mary. And I believe it highlights a deep-seated need for a more balanced approach to religion, one in which traditional male forms of power are balanced with female energy and power. I want to share with you an example of what this might look like, what this could look like. It is a prayer that was written by an Episcopal priest named Reverend Alla René Bozarth. This prayer demonstrates what it could be like if we truly balanced the feminine and the masculine in the Christian faith. It states, before Jesus was his mother. Before supper in the upper room, there was breakfast in the barn. Before the Passover feast, there was a feeding trough. And before there was the altar of the earth, there were fair linens of hay and seed. Before his cry, her cry. Before his sweat of blood, her bleeding and tears. Before his offering, hers. Before the breaking of bread and death, the breaking of her body in birth. Before the offering of the cup, the offering of her breast. Before his blood, her blood. And by her body and blood alone, his body and blood and a whole human being. The wise men knelt to hear the woman's word in wonder. Holding up her sacred child, her God, in the form of a babe, she said, receive, receive, and let your hearts be healed, and your lives be filled with love. For this is my body, this is my blood. If we put a prayer like that alongside scriptures like the Magnificat, which are subversive scriptures for justice, that side with the needs of the poor, then we also begin to restore the divine feminine to its right place, in balance with and in concert with the masculine. In the life and the legends of Mary, the mother of Jesus, one can find the spirit of a woman who can give us all hope and help us rebalance and recalibrate our lives and our religions and our spirituality in a way that embraces all of us and the heart, the true heart of humanity and the Spirit of God. No matter what station in life you come from, no matter your heritage or your lineage or your bloodline, each of us can be a vessel for the sacred, a vessel for God in the world and justice. It often happens in the most unexpected moments, at times when we don't think we're the right person or that it's even possible. We all have to look honestly at ourselves and ask the question, the very personal and very spiritual question, where have I found myself in this moment and why? I'll close with a story from the Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. One of his rabbinical students told him a story about her great aunt Susie. It was a day with a light snowfall on the crowded streets of Munich in Nazi Germany. She was riding a city bus home from work when Nazi soldiers entered the bus to examine identification papers. The Jews on the bus were being told to leave the bus and get into a truck around the corner. Susie watched from her seat in the rear as the soldiers systematically worked their way down the aisle. She began to tremble, tears streaming down her face. When the man next to her noticed that she was crying, he politely asked her why. "I don't have papers like you have. I'm a Jew. They're going to take me," she said. And when he heard this, the man exploded with disgust. He began to curse and scream at her. "You stupid woman," he roared. "I cannot stand being near you." The SS men asked what all the yelling was about. "Damn her," the man shouted angrily. "My wife has forgotten her papers again. I am so fed up. She always does this." And the soldiers laughed, and they moved on. And the woman's great aunt never saw the man again, never even knew his name. But that's how it happens to ordinary people in ordinary places on an ordinary day, when suddenly we realize that we are called to do something exceptional, something sacred, something beloved. God bless you. Amen.